So, a couple of things. Stay tuned because I need to make something of an announcement at the end of this video regarding where I've been and the lack of updates. But I'd just also like to say that I'd like to wish the film over there next to License to Kill a happy 30th birthday. Friday the 13th, Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan. Which brings me to, well, what the title of this video and the subject is going to be. The summer of 1989. I was not born or alive at that time, but from what I've studied and observed of the culture of that era, especially that year, it was probably one of the, if not the biggest summer for blockbusters, even when compared to today. Because sure, we've got like a blockbuster season that doesn't seem to end. I mean, Deadpool was a big hit on blockbuster levels, and it came out in February of 2016. Not even the summer, not the holiday season, or anything like that. And we've got all the Marvel movies coming out this year, the ones that have been released already, the ones still expected to come in the future, the God knows what number Disney live action remake that's out, and yeah, there is no comparing the current atmosphere of blockbusters to the summer of 1989, or even the entire year for movies in general, but especially the summer movies. Where do I even begin? Well, it may have just been the 30th anniversary of Jason Takes Manhattan, but let's go back a little more to May, when Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade was released. Now, keep in mind, at the time, this was a very, very big deal because this was the third film in a trilogy, and at the time, considered the last Indiana Jones film. And immediately after that, or like within the next week or so, we had Ghostbusters 2 and Batman. My apologies, these multi packs are. I'm only focusing on the first Batman and the Lethal Weapon sequel. I don't have an individual DVD case for those, but that's neither here nor there. And in and then along came License to Kill, Lethal Weapon 2, and I don't think. Sure, blockbusters had been around since roughly 1975 when the first one, Jaws, was released. And ever since then, there was always a lot of variety. You had sci fi with the releases, the Star Wars films in 77, 80, and 83, the Jaws sequel in 78, the slasher craze of the 80s. But I think what made the summer of 1989 special was the fact that you had a superhero movie, a slasher movie, an adventure movie, a long running entry in a series, License to Kill, an action buddy cop movie, and a comedy, Ghostbusters 2, all released within the same time frame. I'm not sure if that lineup, in terms of what was available to see at a theater at that time, was unique to that year. I'm pretty sure pretty much any other year in the 80s had that kind of variety, but what made that this year, and especially that summer, so special wasn't just the variety, but also just what big names were being released and the impact that they would have for years to come. Batman, especially, while he'd been a marketable character almost since the day he arrived, which at the time was 50 years ago at that point, uh, his film was probably the most heavily marketed since Star Wars. You had merchandise, you had advertisements all over. In fact, in Jason Takes Manhattan, during one of the opening shots of the city of Manhattan, you could actually see an ad for Batman that was put up in Times Square at the time. That's how big an impact that film left. It actually began to They actually began to sort of seep into each other. In addition to Jason Takes Manhattan, which happened roughly a month or so after Ghostbusters 2, a comedy horror series that had established it taking place in New York. We saw more of Manhattan in Ghostbusters 2 than we did in Jason Takes Manhattan. So, yeah, for people disappointed with one, you had the other. Keep in mind, movies, they ran in theaters for a lot longer than they do today. They're often in theaters for maybe a weekend or so, depending on how marketable they are. And then they're immediately shifted to whatever streaming or home media release that they can get. But yeah, even though VHS was available and video rentals were about almost as big as theatrical releases, especially in 1989, if they could, studios would stretch out how long they could keep a film making a theatrical run as long as possible. I think Batman stayed in theaters all throughout the summer and almost into November in some places. And a few honorable mentions to some that I don't have a cover for, including Little Mermaid, which is getting, of course it is, a live action remake in the coming months to a year. And why it pisses not just me, but a lot of people off that is even being was even considered, is because you have to remember, in 1989, Disney was not the powerhouse that they are today. They were struggling financially after a series of commercial failures, both in their animation and even in live action films. Live action films, unlike today, was not making them any money in the long run. Everything from Tron to Flight of the Navigator and several The Return to Oz, some of the most iconic live action Disney films of that era. When they were originally released, they were not box office successes, and they didn't do well critically either very well. It only wasn't until years later that they actually got the recognition that they did. And especially with their animated films, they just did not do well. They were considering leaving the animation industry entirely if Little Mermaid was another failure. But it was going back to what made them so beloved while Walt himself was alive, and rediscovering their roots in making Little Mermaid a musical that brought back the iconography of a Disney princess that actually saved them, and not only ushered in the Disney Renaissance, but also the animation Renaissance in both film and television that lasted all through the 90s. And something could be said about movies from that year too. Even though Indiana Jones ended, James Bond went on hiatus till 1995, even though License to Kill was a moderate success. Although it was more of a copyright reason that James Bond went into hiatus. Those slasher movies, though, while they do have their place among fans of these series and the genre, yeah, the next Friday the 13th film wasn't out until 1994, I believe, or 1993. I'm not sure. And it was supposed to be the last one. Nightmare on Elm Street's final film, and I use that in quotes, was released just 2 years later in 1991. And yeah, again, like I said, it was touted as the final one. Halloween, it was nearly 6 years between 5 and Part 6, and I could make a whole nother video on what a disaster Part 6 was. And all that can be traced back to this year, even though because Jason Takes Manhattan, Elm Street 5, Halloween 5, they were probably the lowest points these franchises had since they started. I mean, Friday the 13th hadn't had a successful film since Part 6. Nightmare on Elm Street, I think 4 was a sign that it was starting to lose its luster too, despite how unique it was when compared to other slasher films. Which is why they probably rushed the production on 5, and then later 6 as fast as possible. The same can be said for Halloween 5. I've heard that it was finished and released in less than a year, maybe 6-7 months between the 4th film, which had a lot more polish to it. If you actually watch them back to back, you can tell. But other films like Lethal Weapon, as you can see, Yeah, they would continue on for the next couple of years, and especially the Batman films. It's like the slasher genre had lost its luster. Some franchises just either ended or went quiet for a while, like Ghostbusters and Indiana Jones. But the action and superhero genres actually became a lot more successful, and there were a lot more sequels to those films. Batman Returns took only like a couple of 89, 3 years to produce. Same with the Weapon sequel, and there were a lot more action movies from the late 80s to into the early 90s. From the Die Hard films, which started the previous year, had a sequel after, which is why I don't have it here. And that can all be traced back to this one summer. The summer of 1989 defined pretty much the landscape of blockbuster movies throughout the 90s. Because while some trends and tastes changed, others began to become more at the forefront. Like, we had more sci-fi films with Jurassic Park, and there was a greater emphasis on, like I said, action movies. James Bond eventually came back to try and get in on that. The slasher film was given new life in 1996 with Scream after, well, pretty much fizzling out with the aforementioned films here. And yeah, it all just goes back to this this one season, this blockbuster season. It defined and it marked the closing of one era and the beginning of another. Okay, so now that that's out of the way, I've just got a few things to say real quick. One, if I sound out of practice, it's because, yes, I am. I've been away due to some unforeseen circumstances that I'm not at liberty to disclose here, and it's going to be maybe another week or so until things are back to normal. I'm not even, if you can't tell, I'm not even at my regular location where I normally film these. That kitchen table that everyone's probably accustomed to. And again, like I said, if I sound a little out of practice, it's because I am. I haven't talked about something that I wanted to do in a while because I've just been a little very busy adjusting to this new location, and it's not well suited for filming. Well, I mean it is, but yeah, different locale is not my thing. And one reason I wanted to do this, in addition to let everyone know that in this update, is also because, like I said, it's recently been the 30th anniversary of several of these films, and the landscape is just so different compared to back then, even though the impact can still be seen even today, in some ways. Like I said at the beginning, I wasn't alive in the summer of 1989. But when I see what's being done in the landscape of cinema and entertainment today, sometimes I just really wish I was.